Hello, iconography students. Hey, Raymond Vincent here. I just wanted to really address something that I've seen a lot over the years, a real difficulty iconography students have, and that is going about purchasing pigments and making good decisions. Generally, what I've seen students do is they wind up buying too many pigments. So I wanted to use a little bit of color theory to just help your selection in getting your pigment palette. So share this here. As most of you might be familiar with, in traditional color theory, we basically can make any color that we want with these three primary colors, red, yellow, and blue. So if we mix them together, we have our secondary colors, orange, green, and violet. So these are the general colors that we have, at least in Western, normal Western color theory. And when we arrange them in the circle, we have what we know as the color wheel. And if we mix in between these colors, now here's our tertiary colors. This is a complete color wheel. So you only need to buy pigments if you have an essential palette where you can get all of these variations. But notice the difference between this color wheel and the one previous to it. This represents what I can do digitally. This, however, represents what we can do with the majority of pigments. So theoretically, we can say you can make almost any color with those three primary colors, but that's in theory. It works well on the computer, but when you're coming to actual materials, we're sort of constrained or limited by the natural propensities of those materials, of the pigments themselves. So the question is, can you paint an icon with just three of those primary colors? The answer is yes, but you're going to be very limited in the amount of colors that you can pull off. They will be, some of them will be very vibrant and intense, and some of them will be dull. So what I recommend, and what was recommended to me when I first started really studying art and painting academically, so this was the recommendation of my professors in school, is to have something like this. This is what we call a co-primary palette, where you have two different versions of each of those primaries. One that's a little duller maybe, or that leans a little more towards violet, just in its natural state, if you look at this red here. And then one that is a little more intense, that leans more warm, where the color is more vibrant, if you look at this red here. Same thing is the case with the yellows, and I'll get to blues in just a minute because they're something of a special case, or it'll make sense when I start to explain it. So this is a co-primary palette. So if you're going to have a very scaled down essentialist palette that will pretty much be able to do anything you ask of it, this is how you should go about selecting your colors. And if I were to translate these co-primaries to pigments, they would be something like this. This is actually on my recommended pigments list that I could share. If you're interested, just message me and I'll share that with you. But this darker red, and I use darker perhaps in quotes, it's really a less saturated red is maybe one way to explain it. All of this circle out here of primaries, of my darker / less saturated, these are really my earth pigments, my pigments made from clays or semi-precious stones. So in the case of red, I'm going to use a red ochre. And for my more intense red, I'm going to use a metallic red. There's lots of different metallic reds. You can use vermilion, you can use cinnabar, you can use minium, which leans more towards the orange, not just pure red. and that's going to give you a much more vibrant red. A modern alternative, if you don't want to use those metallic reds, is cadmium red. With the yellows, my earth yellow is definitely going to be yellow ochre. That is my go-to. Though I do like an orange ochre, and I'll explain how to build on this co-primaries in a minute here. But definitely yellow ochre. For my more intense yellow, I like to use chrome oxide yellow. Cadmium yellow is a modern alternative for that, or tin yellow can also work for that more intense yellow color. For my earth blue, what I like to use is Ultramarine Blue, which is a semi-precious stone. And for my more intense blue, I actually like to use Prussian Blue. Now, Prussian Blue, when you look at it, is much, much darker, but it makes much more vibrant colors when you mix it. So just to go again, a co-primary palette translated into pigments is red ochre. For sake of convenience, let's just say cadmium red, yellow ochre, and then chrome yellow, ultramarine blue, and then Prussian blue. So theoretically, you can make all the colors you need, and maybe need should be in quotes, all the colors you need with that co-primary palette. So how do we build on top of that? One, there's two different questions, or maybe three different questions you need to ask yourself. The first question is, are there colors in iconography that are just conventional, that you just need in order to do anything else? And the answer is absolutely yes. To tint those colors, you're going to need a white. If you don't have a white, you can't really paint. So theoretically, is it possible to only paint with those colors? Yes, but then you can only move, theoretically, you can only move chromatically. You can only move within color. You can't move within value. So you need a way to tint them. So you're going to need a white. I recommend just to go with titanium white. Titanium white can be dangerous, not really dangerous to your health, but dangerous in the sense that it's really easy to use too much titanium too quickly. So titanium is one of those colors, use with caution, get to know its personality, get to know its strength, because you can't overuse titanium white. But titanium is really your go-to whitening color. If you feel so inclined, I also recommend lead white. Lead white is it's much warmer. It's more buttery in its sensation. It's really a beautiful white to use, but just realize you're going to need to use more of it because it doesn't have the tinting strength of your titanium. There's also zinc white, but zinc white really has special properties that we don't need to get into now, that it isn't quite as good for tinting. So you're going to need white. Also, there are certain colors in iconography, like we said, that are just conventional. You're going to need a rich, darker red. Sometimes that red ochre can't get you where you want to go. You can darken it, but by the time you darken it, you lose its saturation. So you need a deep, rich, dark red. And for that, you're going to need some kind of hematite. Hematite red, it also can go by Indian red. So there's lots of different names for that pigment, but it's a red oxide pigment. So those are two right off the bat that you have to add to that co-primary palette to really do iconography. The red around halos, red in inscriptions on gold. There's so many different things you're going to use that hematite for, that it does make sense. It does make sense to purchase that. So as I said, you can mix all the colors you want with that co-primary palette, but you have to ask yourself the question, do I want to keep mixing that same color over and over and over again? So here's a way to start helping you decide which colors you need to purchase. If you want a nice brown that just takes you forever to mix, and it's very difficult to mix a rich brown, then buy a brown pigment. Buy a burnt umber and a burnt sienna. I recommend buying both of those because they have different qualities. Your burnt umber is very dark. It's very rich, and you can use it to do different things. You can mix it with blue to create a black. I don't even use black pigment. I have nothing but trouble with most black pigments because they're usually carbon, and carbon, it floats to the top. It's difficult to break down, so I just bypass it altogether. And I'll use my burnt umber as a black, or just with a mix of a little bit of blue can achieve the black that you want. And it's a rich black. It's not sort of a neutral dead black. So definitely burnt umber should be on your list. Also burnt sienna. Burnt sienna has a much warmer sensation to it. It's lighter in value, but it's redder, it's warmer. So I find myself using burnt sienna a lot for any kind of rich brown because I want that touch of red. I want it to lean warm. So things like painting in the hair, the iris of the eyes for brown eyes, that's going to be an essential color to help in those directions. I also like a golden ochre because sometimes that yellow ochre can be a little too pale. So those are just different ranges of browns to oranges that are useful. But there's certain situations where you really need to look and say, okay, do I need to purchase another pigment to really achieve a secondary color that I'm after? Green, traditionally, we did have green pigments play a major role in icon painting, but I actually think there's a historical reason for that. So it's not difficult to mix a rich green. The problem is in antiquity, if all you had was the semi-precious stone of lapis lazuli to make your green out of, guess what? You didn't use a semi-precious stone to mix to make, grass. There's nothing wrong with grass, but you would save that blue for that special treatment. Therefore, you would go out and find a green pigment because you didn't want to use your good blues for mixing. Today, with synthetically made ultramarine blue is just a synthetic lapis lazuli, or it's a synthetic that has kind of replaced lapis lazuli. You can mix a good green. So I don't bother having a bright green in my palette. Every once in a while, if I need to cover a large area, or I need to do something very consistently over a few icons that need to have the same green grass, I will use a chrome oxide green, but it's not necessarily something I would recommend going out that you must purchase. Violet is a little different. So even with that co-primary palette, it's very difficult to mix a rich, suitable violet. So that's one that I do recommend. You need to buy a pigment that can get you there. If you want a violet that you can mix your way towards, definitely get some kind of crimson, alizarin crimson, or one of the lake colors, Madder Lake, Rose Lake, anything like that. That's going to help you get that really rich violet or that violet red that you're looking for with it, particularly in the garments. The Theotokos is a common area that you want that. Otherwise, your violets tend to look a little pale, which is fine, but just know that that's the case. If you want that really pale violet aesthetic, go for it. But if you want that really deep violet, you're going to need one of those lake colors. And those lakes are actually dyes. So the reason why those are desirable is because if you want something to represent that really deep violet dye color, use a dye pigment. And I use them sparingly, or I use them particularly in washes or floats, just to modify garments that I've painted in more earth or metallic pigments. And then I just glaze on top of it, and it just brings it to that really beautiful violet color. I don't actually recommend that you buy very purple, super purple looking pigments because I haven't really found them to be terribly useful. So those are the things that are going to govern your purchases: is what is conventional, what color do I need because I use it a lot and it's just easier to buy it outright, what colors are difficult to mix, that I'm mixing all the time, that I need a pigment that's already there or at least close to it, and what secondary colors are just almost impossible to get and the level of saturation that I want to achieve those really intense secondaries, particularly like violet. So if you use that rubric, you won't have this expansive pigment collection. Learn to mix first. Learn to use what you have, and then move outside of that. So the last thing that I haven't really talked about is everything I've said so far has to do with chroma, has to do with getting a really intense desired color. But in iconography, we work from dark to light generally, but we also work desaturated to more saturated. We work from dull to bright. So when you just focus on these really, like I said, really pretty colors, you're actually limiting what you can do as far as icons. So that second mistake that students often tend to do when they go about purchasing pigments for iconography, not only do they buy too many, but they also buy colors that aren't particularly useful because they're not dull enough. You have to muddy them up to make them useful. So go ahead and give yourself a freedom to buy colors that might not look good, but they're fantastic for your underpaintings. They're fantastic for those beginning steps in the process, because you don't want to rush all the way to those most bright, intense colors, because then there's nowhere to go on top of that. Just like you don't start bright because there's nowhere to build on top of that, you don't start brilliant because there's nowhere to build on top of that. So one color that must be in your collection, it doesn't necessarily look vibrant and beautiful, but it is an absolute workhorse, is raw sienna. Get a good raw sienna. Also, get a good raw umber. So I always have a burnt umber and a raw umber, a burnt sienna and a raw sienna. I use my raw umbers oftentimes in those underpaintings of the face. I personally don't like a very cool green in that underpainting. I want it to be something more olive. That's just my preference. But I don't want to paint the underpainting of the skin, or I don't want to mix that same color over and over again. I want to have consistency throughout my work. I want it to be easy because I do paint every single day, more or less. So I want my go-to pigment that I know this is what I do underpainting for skin tone is. And that's going to be my burnt umber. Experiment, try these out. There's all kinds of different pigments you can look at. It might take you a while to find what you settle into, but settle into that palette, learn those pigments. Don't overspend. Don't purchase too many pigments. Purchase what you need. And that's all I have.